August 1953, only 8 months after Dwight D. Eisenhower entered office as President of the United States. A black sedan made its way through the streets of Tehran, Iran. Inside, hidden under a blanket, was CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt. Once inside the royal palace gates, the car door opened and in stepped His Imperial Majesty Reza Pahlavi, the young Shah of Iran, codenamed the Boy Scout. In a hushed voice, Roosevelt disclosed the details of Project Ajax, a secret CIA plot to overthrow leftist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, codenamed the Old Bugger. The Shah would be maintained on the throne. At stake were immense oil reserves and a strategic location in the southern border of the Soviet Union. In the weeks that followed, Roosevelt used $10,000 to rent a mob of muscle men to incite riots against the Tudeh Communist Party and bully Prime Minister Mossadegh out of office. After a 2-hour battle raged outside his residence, a tearful Mossadegh slipped out the back and fled. Roosevelt sent a victory telegram to the Shah, who had been hiding in Rome.
Like most great CIA covert operations, they succeed partly because of a plot and partly by accident. The young Shah was sort of caught by surprise himself. He was so excited that Kermit Roosevelt had done this for him, he said something to the effect that, "I owe my throne to God and my people and to you," looking straight at Kermit Roosevelt.
The coup in Iran caused a sensation around the world and emboldened the CIA, giving its agents an exaggerated sense of confidence. For the next decade, as the world's two superpowers confronted each other in an atomic standoff, the Central Intelligence Agency destabilized national economies, toppled leftist regimes, and plotted assassinations. What few people realized was that the responsibility for ordering these covert acts fell squarely on the shoulders of the friendly-looking fellow in the White House. While he appeared to be casual and amiable, aides close to Eisenhower saw a very different side to the man.
There was a very profound difference between the outer projection and the man himself when he got down to business. Mostly, this is one tough SOB.
As he went along, cultivating this image of a benign, even bumbling grandfather, Dwight Eisenhower orchestrated some of the most devious covert operations the world has ever known. For most of the 1950s, the hidden hand of President Eisenhower was pulling the strings and very consciously shaping the balance of global power. Dwight David Eisenhower was born to Ida and David Eisenhower in 1890 and raised in the frontier town of Abilene, Kansas. He enjoyed a rough-and-tumble upbringing in which hard work, fishing, and shooting were routine. He also developed a skill that later in his career he would use to his advantage.
He was a person with a basically shrewd cast of mind who, as a teenager, had learned poker from some backwoods Abilene hobo, and he was just very good at calculating, figuring the odds, and at bluffing.
When Eisenhower's parents were unable to afford his college tuition, he entered a statewide competition and won a free education. His boyhood nickname, Ike, would follow him all the way to West Point. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, Ike hoped for an overseas command. He was one of the first officers in the U.S. Army to recognize the potential of a new weapon, the tank. In late 1918, within a week of receiving orders to take his unit to France, the armistice was signed. For the next 20 years, Ike, accompanied by his wife Mamie, had to content himself with staff positions on foreign soil. In Panama, where he became an aficionado of military history under General Fox Connors, and in the Philippines, where he struggled to live up to the expectations of the sometimes difficult General Douglas MacArthur.
Grant had kept a diary, and there's this really sad moment. He gets back to Manila after an extended trip to the United States, and literally his key does not fit the door. His replacement has been appointed in his absence. And there is this devastating moment in his diary where he says, "I will not give the general the satisfaction knowing that I'm through in the staff. I don't know what I could have possibly done wrong. All I wanted to do is basically serve this man."
The experience so disheartened Ike that he considered quitting the military. At the outbreak of World War II, Ike, already 51 years old and still only a lieutenant colonel, was assigned staff duty under General George Marshall. Ike so impressed his boss with his organizational skills that after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Marshall named him Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, leapfrogging him over 366 more senior candidates. In June of 1942, Ike left for England to assume his new post. His first exposure to the secret tactics of war occurred during his visit to Chequers, the weekend retreat of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. As Churchill filled Ike in on the hidden weapons the Allies were using to fight Hitler, including Bletchley Park, where the Brits were already decrypting the German secret military codes, it was obvious that the American general was completely naive when it came to the uses of intelligence. In this regard, he was not unlike many Americans of his generation, who had been taught to believe that gentlemen did not read each other's mail. When Ike was placed at the head of Operation Torch, the secret invasion of North Africa, he was so taken with British code-breaking abilities that he based his strategy for the battle at Kasserine Pass on decrypted messages from the German general staff. Unfortunately, what he had no way of knowing was that General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, would disobey the orders of his superiors. Despite the failure at Kasserine Pass, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park proved to be Ike's most effective spies because they allowed him to penetrate German military intelligence planning. This was essential as Ike began to develop the most critical campaign of the war, Overlord, the secret cross-channel invasion of occupied France. Ike knew that he had to trick the Germans into thinking that the landing would take place at a location other than Normandy, where it was planned. In order to do this, double agents leaked information detailing a false invasion operation and backed it up with Project Fortitude, which created a fictitious U.S. Army group, commanded by General George Patton. Ike was proving himself to be a quick study in the art of deception. On June 6, 1944, 176,000 fighting men in thousands of ships crossed the English Channel and landed on the coast of France.
This is the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted in the history of warfare, to keep it secret so that the Germans weren't just waiting. All success depended upon that.
The D-Day invasion was a smashing success. The Germans were completely fooled. At war's end, Ike returned a national hero. His optimism and innate practicality appealed enormously to a nation weighed down by fears of the Red Menace. As president of Columbia University in 1948, Ike rubbed shoulders with members of the scientific community that had pioneered cutting-edge work that helped win the war, including radar and nuclear fission. The next year, he shared in the public's concern when the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb and the world entered a new era. In 1950, after he'd accepted the job as first Supreme Commander of NATO, Ike watched the United States slide into yet another conflict in Korea. This time, however, the stakes were potentially higher. He found himself plagued by questions that were new and frightening.
How does the United States engage in combat now that atomic weapons had been developed? When was it appropriate to use them? What were the dangers, and especially after the Chinese intervention, of a local conflict escalating into a global conflict in which the possible cost to this would be staggering?
Eisenhower was convinced that the cause of the Korean War was a failure of a policy of deterrence. Initially reluctant to consider running for president, he began to feel that he alone was equipped to deal with the threat of advancing communism in a nuclear minefield. In 1952, he accepted the Republican nomination for president and won a landslide victory. As Ike prepared to take over the reins of leadership, the lessons he'd learned about deception and covert behavior were very much with him. It would not be long before he would put them to use. After his election, Dwight Eisenhower's first order of business was to bring an end to the Korean War. In December of 1952, he traveled to Korea to gather additional intelligence, but a solution still eluded him. During the initial months of his administration, various strategic options were weighed, including the use of atomic weapons. According to associates, Ike asked the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru to carry the threat of an atomic strike on Korea to the Russians. Whether the message was ever relayed is unclear, but shortly thereafter an armistice was concluded. As far as Eisenhower was concerned, the United States and the Soviets were engaged in a winner-take-all struggle, and the world hung in the balance. He was, however, acutely aware of the danger and cost of massing a conventional military force. He saw the CIA as another, perhaps more efficient means to tip that balance. Shortly after taking office, Ike's newly appointed director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, alerted him that a communist takeover was imminent in Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected president, had recently instituted a land reform program, expropriating foreign-owned property and returning it to the peasants. This policy enraged the powerful U.S.-owned United Fruit Company, which until then had controlled 40% of all arable land in Guatemala. The fruit company boasted powerful friends in the U.S. administration, including both Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, now Secretary of State, both of whom had worked as lawyers for United Fruit. Flushed with the success of their coup in Iran, the CIA presented Ike with a plan to overthrow the Arbenz government. It entailed training a small group of mercenaries on a base in Honduras, to be led by the local folk hero Castillo Armas. Soon CIA airplanes were buzzing Guatemala, dropping small bombs. When Arbenz appealed to Moscow for help, Eisenhower ordered a naval blockade. The CIA delivered the final coup de grace by broadcasting over the radio that an invasion force was on its way to Guatemala. Fearful that Eisenhower was about to send in the Marines, Jacobo Arbenz fled to Switzerland.
It was sort of anti-communism on the cheap, and by doing it secretly, they could use dirty tricks, and hopefully nobody would find out.
On the surface, the United States still operated under the good neighbor policy, which meant non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries in the Western Hemisphere.
You're not a very good neighbor if you go around overthrowing governments. For Eisenhower personally, though, even if in fact the United States was caught with its proverbial hands in the cookie jar, it was important for Eisenhower not to pay the cost if there was a cost to pay.
To ensure secrecy, Eisenhower and his closest confidants devised a policy that was designed to completely distance the president from these activities. The concept came to be known as plausible deniability.
The whole notion was that heads of state needed to be able to do dastardly things without getting caught doing them. They wanted the capacity to assassinate people or overthrow governments or break foreign laws or do things that would look bad if they were disclosed. They wanted to be able to do that, but they wanted to do it without being held responsible.
In September of 1954, Viet Minh forces laid siege to the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, sparking yet another international crisis that threatened to draw the United States into armed conflict. Eisenhower was well aware that if the French were to lose Dien Bien Phu, they would lose their last foothold in Indochina, and the entire region would fall into communist hands. To the American public, Eisenhower did little to address the issues at hand.
There is the famous press conference in which his aides warn him not to say anything about a very tense international crisis. The press secretary Haggerty says the State Department asks you not to say anything if that question comes up, to refuse to talk. And Eisenhower says to Haggerty, "Don't worry, Jim, if that comes up, I'll just confuse them."
In a role that he would assume time and time again, Ike receded into the background and let his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, take on the job of articulating administration policy.
People might have said at the time, wouldn't it be terrible if Dulles died, Eisenhower would become president, and he wouldn't know how to handle foreign policy.
Dulles, along with Vice President Richard Nixon and two of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for military intervention. During the final days of Dien Bien Phu, they even supported Vulture, a secret plan to drop atomic bombs on the Viet Minh. Eisenhower, however, rejected Vulture. Although he agreed to loan bombers to the French, he held the view that without support from other NATO member nations, it would be a costly mistake to commit American fighting men to Vietnam. The one thing he did agree to do was unleash CIA operative Edward Lansdale. Lansdale engaged in a grab bag of dirty tricks to harass the Viet Minh, which included running an ineffective psychological warfare campaign and pouring sugar in gas tanks to sabotage Hanoi's public transportation system. After the French defeat, diplomats at the Geneva Accords partitioned Vietnam. Holding out the promise of nationwide elections, the French turned control of the North over to the communist leader and national hero Ho Chi Minh. They allowed the South to be put into the hands of a fiercely ambitious Catholic politician named Ngo Dinh Diem, who promptly reneged on the promise to hold national elections. As Saigon turned into a city of spies, intrigue, and Byzantine plots, Lansdale and his CIA agents did their best to prop up the faltering regime of Diem. But President Eisenhower had more pressing concerns that lay closer to home. Worried that the defense establishment was going to drive America into bankruptcy, he focused on pioneering a new spy technology, one that would change the world of espionage forever. For President Eisenhower and others of his generation, the primary fear was a nuclear strike by the Soviet Union, hitting the U.S. as suddenly as Pearl Harbor. This fear was heightened early in 1954 when the Soviets began testing for their own thermonuclear bomb. Later that spring, intelligence officers on the rooftop of the American embassy in Moscow photographed a new intercontinental bomber called the Bison. It was clear that the Soviets possessed a delivery system that could carry a nuclear warhead all the way to America. An arms race was underway. And while President Eisenhower believed that inside information was the best deterrent, his military advisors thought otherwise. Claiming that national security was at stake, they pushed hard for more weapons funding.
The best way to counter this momentum was to gather better intelligence, to know what your enemy is doing and therefore respond appropriately. If you don't know what your enemy is doing, you tend to plan based on worst-case scenarios, and this could be incredibly expensive. It also, by the way, might frighten your adversary.
Eisenhower wanted an early warning on any mobilization of Soviet planes or troops, but the CIA was unable to penetrate the Iron Curtain to set up spy networks inside Russian territory. On the basis of his World War II experience, Ike suggested a different approach.
Something which we now take for granted in the world was pioneered by Eisenhower, and this is the notion that you have a capacity to gather intelligence from the air.
The Air Force made several attempts to fly over the Soviet Union using redesigned bombers and unmanned balloons, but the results were disappointing. From his days as president of Columbia University, Ike knew to turn to the scientific community for help. He set up the Surprise Attack Panel, which included James Killian, the president of MIT, and Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera. Edwin Land knew that cameras were available that made high-altitude precision photography possible. Believing that a good picture was worth 1,000 spies, the panel began casting about for a way to overfly the Soviet Union. On the day before Thanksgiving, 1954, Killian, Land, and Allen Dulles slipped into the White House for a clandestine meeting with President Eisenhower. The plan they presented was so secretive that no one was permitted to commit it to paper.
They make their spiel, and they're not even fully finished, meaning they haven't gone to their second and third line of argument, what basically says, how quickly can you do it? I mean, go ahead, do it. Which really they were shocked.
The plan called for the construction of a single-engine spy plane that could soar as high as 70,000 feet, out of the reach of radar detection. Eisenhower's only restriction was that he did not want uniformed pilots violating Soviet airspace. That meant the project was to be put in the hands of the CIA. The plane came to be called the U-2. 9 months later, at a secret airstrip in Nevada, the U-2 took its first flight. From 13 miles in the air, the U-2's camera brought into focus objects nearly as small as Ike's golf cart. In July of 1955, armed with the foreknowledge of the U-2, Eisenhower traveled to Geneva to attend his first conference with the Soviets. He stunned his audience by making his boldest speech yet on the Cold War. Called Open Skies, it proposed that both the Soviet Union and the United States agree to violate each other's airspace to see if the other side was preparing to attack. Ike hoped that the mere presentation of Open Skies would take some of the danger out of Cold War confrontation. The Russians, however, were not receptive.
When we went for tea after the session broke up, it was Khrushchev who came walking up to Eisenhower, and he said, "Niet, niet, niet. This is unacceptable. You are trying to look into our bedrooms."
Eisenhower had no intention of holding his spy plane back. In early June of 1956, Ike gave permission for the U-2 to overfly the Soviet Union. Unbeknownst to the CIA, Russian radar immediately tracked the flight. Within days, Khrushchev issued a firm diplomatic protest. But because the U-2 was a civilian plane, Eisenhower was able to honestly respond that the U.S. Air Force had not violated Soviet airspace.
Every morning, in principle, whenever I could catch him, which was most of the time, I gave him an intelligence update of the overnight intelligence from the CIA, from the State Department, and from the Defense Department. So he was clued in on intelligence just about as thoroughly as anybody could be.
Over the next 2 years, U-2 photos revealed that the Soviets did not have the numbers of Bison bombers that military planners had estimated. As a result, Eisenhower was able to drastically cut back on defense spending. While the U-2 helped stabilize the relationship between the two superpowers, the information it provided could never be shared with the American public. As a result, Eisenhower was oddly paralyzed. What he knew, ordinary citizens could not know. It would not be long before the American people would begin to wonder whether the president was turning soft. In October of 1957, the Russians took the world by surprise by successfully launching a satellite the size of a basketball. They called it Sputnik, meaning fellow traveler. For Eisenhower, the political fallout was shattering. The success of Sputnik seemed to herald a technological watershed.
Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations.
Pounded by the press to allay fears over national security, he had nothing to offer but his word. The U-2 photos that proved the Russians did not have military superiority were locked in a CIA vault. Then, in November of 1957, the president suffered a stroke. And while his critics clamored for more military spending, a new crisis began to emerge only 90 miles off the Florida coast. Cuba had long been a playground for rich Americans who wanted to escape the puritanical mores of home. In Havana, they could buy sexual favors and gamble legally in casinos controlled by the American gangster Meyer Lansky. For the past 2 decades, Cuba's dictator Fulgencio Batista had run the country more along the lines of a mob organization than a traditional government. But by late 1957, Batista's brutality had alienated Cubans and offended even old supporters in the United States. With his regime beginning to fail, officials in the State Department searched for a successor who could meet Cuba's demands for social change. Before they could react, events spun out of control. CIA agents watched with alarm as a charismatic rebel leader named Fidel Castro began to train a guerrilla force in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. In the spring of 1958, Castro's band turned the tide against Batista's troops. 6 months later, Castro entered Havana as a victorious conqueror. In 1959, Castro paid a visit to New York City. He met with a leery Vice President Richard Nixon and delivered a 4-hour diatribe to diplomats at the United Nations.
When Castro came to power, his head was full of sort of vague ideas of Thomas Jefferson and freedom and liberty, and he was not a communist. But we overreacted, and by withdrawing our support and seeing him as a communist threat, we actually opened the door for the communists to go in there.
When Castro began expropriating foreign-owned land, the multinational oil companies and sugar barons also began putting pressure on the Eisenhower administration to get rid of Castro.
By the end of 1959, the CIA was proposing to assassinate Fidel Castro, and the State Department also had come to the president and said, "We don't think we can live with Castro anymore."
By January of 1960, Ike was persuaded that something had to be done. He authorized the creation of a CIA task force to come up with a plan to overthrow the Cuban government.
Eisenhower was absolutely clear on this. More than once, he said during meetings that it had to be conducted in a way as to keep U.S. fingerprints off of the operation.
On March 17, 1960, Eisenhower authorized $4 million to fund a covert operation to train a cadre of Cuban exiles, supply them with arms, and infiltrate them into the mountains of Cuba. Secrecy was of the utmost importance. The plot thickened when Castro seized the mob's casinos and nationalized them, and the CIA realized they had a new ally.
There's no question that in August and September 1960, the CIA attempted to hire the Mafia to kill Castro. The Mafia agreed to do it, although they were such patriots in the Mafia, they didn't want to be paid.
Mob bosses wanted to use poison, so CIA labs concocted several deadly potions that could be slipped to Castro. However, finding a delivery mechanism proved to be difficult. After several hitmen backed out, the plan was aborted.
There is a theory here that the mob was just bluffing. Really what the mob was doing was picking up a marker. Knowing that the United States might prosecute them one day, the Mafia dons wanted to pick up an IOU.
How much President Eisenhower actually knew about the assassination plot was investigated in 1975 by Senator Frank Church's committee. No conclusion was ever reached. The question remains under debate to this day.
My own hunch on this is that he did not. Now, that may be because he didn't want to. He may have felt he'd given enough guidance by saying this guy's got to go or we've got to get rid of this guy. They use euphemisms that don't come out and say let's assassinate him, but could be interpreted by the ever-eager CIA to be a hit order.
By the end of 1960, the covert operation had escalated into a secret paramilitary assault plan on Cuba with a budget of $44 million. The plan called for the CIA to land a force of about 1,000 armed men in the coastal city of Trinidad. Eisenhower stipulated that it would only be launched in support of a popular uprising, in case one was to occur in Cuba. But aides close to President Eisenhower were alarmed.
I recall I had an exchange with him, rather sharp exchange, in fact. And I said on one occasion, there's always the risk that if this force is set up, it will develop a momentum of its own.
General Goodpaster worried that such an invasion might be given the green light without Ike's express approval.
And he snapped at me, in fact, and he said, "Not while I'm here." And I said, "Well, sir, that's just the problem. You're not going to be here much longer."
Contrary to General Goodpaster's version of events, there is evidence that during his last days in office, Eisenhower bequeathed the plot to President-elect Kennedy, with an unequivocal recommendation that he proceed. Kennedy, for his part, did not want to be seen as the man who overruled an operation that the famous D-Day commander had authorized.
I don't think the history books have fully reflected the degree to which the Eisenhower administration really set this train in motion and then made it very, very difficult for the young incoming president to stop it, since it had already left the station.
The momentum proved irresistible. 4 months later, President John Kennedy authorized an amphibious invasion now known by the ignominious name the Bay of Pigs. The debacle would stain Kennedy's record and end the careers of several in the CIA, including its director, Allen Dulles. And while Ike managed to dodge the Bay of Pigs, he was not able to escape blame for another CIA fiasco which caught him in his own web of secrecy. During his presidency, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the famous general, wanted to be remembered more as a man of peace than a man of war. As he entered the final years of his term, his primary objective was to limit the arms race. He knew from the U-2 photos that Soviet missiles were not a threat, and he believed there was a real possibility that he could effect a test ban treaty before he left office. By 1958, Ike was beginning to establish a rapport with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and did not want anything to jeopardize that relationship. He knew the Soviets were tracking the U-2 with radar, and now there was evidence that they were also firing surface-to-air missiles at the aircraft. In 1959, Ike invited Khrushchev to America for a 10-day visit. He wanted the volatile Russian to see the town where he was born and to understand that Americans also knew the value of hard work. By the end of the visit, Ike was optimistic that he and Khrushchev could put the worst of the Cold War behind them. By April of 1960, Ike was preparing for a peace summit with Khrushchev to be held in Paris. He ordered the U-2 flights to stop. But the CIA wanted a good look at the Soviet missile installation at Churatum and pleaded for one more flight. Ike relented. The flight was delayed several days because of weather. Finally, on April 30th, the U-2 took off from a base in Peshawar, Pakistan.
I got a call during the night that the plane was missing and not reported. And I, of course, called him. He was up at Gettysburg, and I had a secure phone to him and said the plane was down somewhere in the Soviet Union.
Ike's advisors issued the cover story that a weather plane had flown off course and was missing. Then, 4 days later, Khrushchev shocked the world with the news that the wreckage of an American spy plane was in his possession. When Khrushchev announced he had the pilot in custody, Ike knew it was time to take full responsibility for the spy mission.
Eisenhower said, well, of course, once it came out, we had to confess it. If you got caught with your hand in the cookie jar, you can't say I was in another room.
Ironically, Ike's approval rating jumped, mainly because the American people were relieved their commander was not asleep at his watch. Ike's relationship with Khrushchev, however, suffered an irrevocable blow. Khrushchev had promised his colleagues in the Politburo that Eisenhower could be trusted, and the U-2 had proven him wrong. It was a personal affront. There would be no nuclear test ban treaty. Even more bitter was the unforeseen legacy left behind by the Central Intelligence Agency. At the time, Ike believed his use of covert operations to overthrow foreign governments could be justified on the basis of national security. But in the years to come, these activities also left a long trail of blood.
In hindsight, it's clear that Eisenhower gave too much power to the CIA. He gave a wild horse its head and allowed them to run amok around the world in ways that were destructive to U.S. interests.
In Iran, the coup that put the Shah on the throne led to a protracted reign of terror. The Shah and his secret police earned themselves one of the worst human rights records in the world, and by the 1970s paved the way for the Ayatollah Khomeini to establish his anti-American Islamic revolutionary state. In Guatemala, the coup that vaulted Castillo Armas into power spawned a brutal military regime and unending civil unrest. By the 1970s, right-wing death squads were sweeping the country, kidnapping and killing tens of thousands of Guatemalans. And in South Vietnam, the CIA's puppet regime of Ngo Dinh Diem would crumble, ending in a bloody coup in 1963. Soon after, American soldiers began fighting the longest war in American history. By war's end, tens of thousands of Americans and millions of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian citizens had been killed in the struggle.
It's a terrible legacy, and Eisenhower, if he could look down or up from wherever he is, would certainly regret that.
Ike's great intelligence coup was the U-2, but it also proved to be his greatest disappointment. The secret plane that did so much to ensure world peace put an end to his hopes for nuclear disarmament and dashed his dream of leaving a lasting legacy of peace. Dwight Eisenhower knew the horrors of war perhaps better than any man elected to the office of president. He used tactics of deception, covert operations, and intelligence gathering to wage peace in a world where war, as he had come to know it, was no longer imaginable. And while Eisenhower and his operatives enjoyed several stunning successes, they also found that deception is a sword that can cut both ways.